Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal the Five Poppies Resort had always carried an air of mystery, a place that catered to power, money, and influence. But beneath its polished exterior and secluded beauty, a web of sinister operations pulsed in the shadows. What was once only whispered about in the world of espionage became terrifyingly real when it drew in people connected to Port Charles, pulling them into a nightmare where every step was a gamble against death. Jason never imagined that when he handed Britt a disposable phone for emergencies, it would lead him back to this very place. Nor did he know that Jocelyn and Vaughn were also being held captive inside its walls. The moment he realized their lives hung in the balance, the stakes shifted entirely. What was supposed to be a desperate rescue for one became a mission to save many, but with each new discovery came deeper danger, layers of betrayal, and a ticking clock that would not stop until blood was spilled. Inside the resort, the atmosphere was suffocating. The corridors were long and unlit, the silence broken only by the faint creak of metal doors and the muffled sounds of fear emanating from locked rooms. Pascal, with his cold efficiency, had set the stage for psychological warfare, breaking down his captives piece by piece while fiercely guarding Dalton's secrets. For Jason, moving through the compound was like entering a labyrinth where every corner could reveal an ambush, every shadow could conceal a man armed and waiting to kill. Yet his determination never faltered. He knew that hesitation would cost lives, and the thought of Jocelyn Curley's daughter being trapped in that place drove him harder than ever. He cut through the darkness with steady focus, finding Britt first, shaken but alive, her eyes filled with relief and disbelief. She had placed her faith in him, and once again, he had come. But the mission was far from over. Jocelyn's presence added another layer of urgency. When Jason finally reached her, the weight of what she had endured was etched into her expression. She was young, unprepared for the brutality she had been thrust into, and yet she had fought to survive long enough for Jason to reach her. The moment she saw him, she clung to the fragile promise that she might actually live to see Port Charles again. Still, Jason's instinct told him there was more to uncover, and when he pushed deeper into the compound, he found Vaughn. The sight of him was devastating, bloated, weak, and barely clinging to consciousness. It was already clear that Vaughn's fate had been sealed long before Jason arrived, but in those fleeting moments, Vaughn's mind remained razor-sharp. With the last of his strength, Vaughn imparted truths too dangerous to leave buried. He spoke of Dalton's experiments, grotesque manipulations of science in the service of greed and control. He revealed Sidwell's financial entanglements, the streams of dirty money that funded the research and ensured its protection. Most chilling of all, he gave Jason the name of the elusive figure orchestrating an alt-hidden force whose reach extended beyond Croatia, beyond the resort, into the very heart of Port Charles itself. The information was both a gift and a curse, burden that Jason now had to carry while ensuring it did not die with Vaughn. But Vaughn's thoughts were not only on the mission. He looked at Jocelyn, his voice faltering but his intention unwavering. He wanted her to live. Whatever lingering affection he carried for her, whatever bond had tied them together, it burned brighter in that moment than his own fear of death. He begged Jason with his eyes, his breath shallow but urgent, to take her and Britt out, to make her survival the only priority. Jason felt the weight of that request like chains on his chest. He had pulled countless people out of impossible situations, but leaving Vaughn behind was a torment that carved into him deeply. Vaughn's sacrifice was not simply tactical, it was human, raw, and final. He was choosing death so Jocelyn could live. As Jason pulled Jocelyn and Britt away, the air around them seemed to thrum with impending destruction. Explosives planted within the resort detonated, tearing through its foundations, and the Five Poppies became an inferno. Jason barely had time to shield the women as fire consumed the halls, the roar of collapsing steel and stone echoing like a requiem for the man they left behind. Vaughn was swallowed by the flames, gone in an instant but immortalized in the memory of those he saved. He died as a soldier, a protector, a man who gave everything in a world where everything could be taken. When Jason emerged into the night, the survivors gasping for air and trembling under the stars, the gravity of what had just happened settled into silence. Britt was alive, Jocelyn was alive, but Vaughn's absence was a wound that would not heal quickly. For Jason, the mission was not truly complete, it had only opened a door to a darker war that was yet to come. The secrets Vaughn passed to him were not just information, they were a map to the next battle, one that would inevitably pull Port Charles deeper into the shadows of Dalton's empire. For Jocelyn, the weight of Vaughn's sacrifice was unbearable. She had seen too much, lost too much, and though she was saved, her heart was branded with guilt and grief. Vaughn's choice would define her in ways she could not yet imagine. And for Jason, carrying both the living and the dead, there was no rest. The night at Five Poppies would haunt him, corridors cloaked in shadow, the desperate eyes of a dying ally, the sound of fire devouring everything. It was a reminder that being a hero was not about saving everyone, but about bearing the unbearable truth that some lives had to be left behind. Vaughn's final words still echoed within him, and Jason knew the fight was far from over. What burned in Croatia was only the beginning. Jocelyn's rescue was not the clean triumph of survival that others might have seen from the outside. It was messy, painful, and wrapped in the lingering shadow of Vaughn's sacrifice. Though her body was intact, her spirit carried fresh wounds. The knowledge that Vaughn had chosen death so she could live gnawed at her, turning gratitude into guilt and leaving her caught between relief and despair. She could not shake the image of him lying broken and resolute, whispering his final words, his last breath dedicated to ensuring her future. For a young woman already hardened by the dangers of Port Charles, this new scar would shape her, pushing her toward an uncertain emotional edge where love, grief, and obligation became nearly impossible to separate. Carly's reaction upon learning her daughter had returned was a storm of contradictions. At first, relief flooded her, an almost physical release from the suffocating fear of losing another child. But that reprieve quickly gave way to fury as details began to surface. The truth about WSB's involvement, about Jocelyn's recruitment, and the dangerous mission Jack Brennan had set in motion, turned Carly's gratitude into volcanic rage. She saw the risk not as an accident of circumstance but as a betrayal orchestrated by men who claimed authority. Carly's protective instincts roared to life, her anger directed at Brennan for endangering Jocelyn, but also beginning to turn toward Jason for keeping secrets, for allowing their world to once again drag her daughter into peril. What began as relief was soon laced with blame, suspicion, and the kind of heartbreak that comes when trust has been stretched to its breaking point. For Jason, the victory of survival was hollow. He had saved Britt, he had saved Jocelyn, but he had not saved Vaughn, and that fact bore down on him like a weight he could not set aside. Vaughn's death replayed in his mind as a litany of what-ifs, every decision and every second re-examined, though he knew the outcome could not have changed. More than just grief, Jason carried the burden of knowledge. Vaughn had entrusted him with damning truths, a chain of names and connections that pointed toward Dalton, Sidwell, and a shadowy figure whose power extended far beyond the wreckage of the resort. Vaughn's sacrifice was not only personal, it was strategic, and Jason knew he owed it to him to ensure that those revelations did not die in the fire. That sense of duty, bound with guilt, made him more determined but also more haunted. Britt, meanwhile, found herself dragged back into a world she had once fought to escape. Five Poppies had been her prison and her test, and Jason's presence reminded her how easily she slipped back into the orbit of violence and secrets. She had convinced herself that she could build a life apart from these endless cycles of blood and betrayal. But standing beside Jason again after such devastation forced her to confront a reality she had tried to deny. His loyalty, his quiet heroism, and the constant shadow of Carly made everything infinitely more complicated. Every glance from Carly, every reminder that Jason's first devotion was always to Carly's family, threatened to pull Britt apart from within. Resentment warred with longing, and the result was a volatility she could barely contain. The collision course between Carly and Britt was inevitable. Both women were tied to Jason, but in such different ways. Carly through decades of unwavering trust and friendship, Britt through the fragile possibility of something more. Now, with Jocelyn's life nearly lost and Vaughn's sacrifice hanging over them, Carly's mistrust of Britt deepened. While Britt bristled at the perpetual comparison to a woman Jason could never seem to set aside. For Jason, caught between them, the strain was unbearable. He did not seek conflict, but his silence and guilt only widened the divide. Each choice he made, whether to reassure Carly or to defend Britt, risked alienating one or the other. Yet the core of the matter lay not in romance but in survival. Vaughn's death had handed Jason a mission bigger than personal attachments. The information Vaughn revealed was a torch that lit the path forward, a warning that Dalton and Sidwell were only pawns in a game controlled by someone more dangerous, more deeply entrenched. Jason could not walk away. He knew that every person he loved was in greater danger than ever, and that the only way to honor Vaughn's memory was to strike before that hidden master could tighten the noose further. But with Carlyle's fury mounting, Jocelyn's grief consuming her, and Britt's conflicted heart pulling him back into a tangle of the past, Jason stood at a crossroads where every step forward came at a personal cost. What remained clear was that Vaughn's death was not an ending, but a beginning. It was the spark that reignited war in Port Charles, a reminder that sacrifices made in shadows always echo in the light. Jocelyn would carry her grief into the choices she made. Carly would not rest until Brennan was held accountable. Britt would wrestle with her place in Jason's chaotic world. And Jason himself would bear the crushing responsibility of both the living and the dead. Vaughn had given him the truth, and now that truth would decide the future for better or for worse. The destruction of Five Poppies by fire and steel may have obliterated its physical presence, but the shadows that clung to its ruins refused to die. For Jason, Britt, and Jocelyn, the resort was no longer just a place on a map. It had become a scar that followed them back to Port Charles, a memory woven into every heartbeat and every breath. Vaughn's sacrifice lingered like smoke after the flames, a haunting reminder that survival was never free. His death did more than save Jocelyn's life. It thrust Jason into possession of knowledge that could shake everything they knew. Secrets whispered in Vaughn's final breaths that revealed a conspiracy reaching far beyond Croatia. The unanswered question was not only how Jason would use that truth, but whether he could bear its weight while shielding those around him from the consequences. For Jocelyn, Vaughn's death was a fracture she could not easily mend. It was not the first time she had encountered loss, but this one was different, because she knew it had been chosen. Vaughn had looked at her, even as his body failed, and decided her life mattered more than his. That act of sacrifice left her with a burden she was too young to carry, the idea that her existence came at the cost of another's. It hardened her in ways Carly would recognize, but it also left her vulnerable, drifting between gratitude toward Jason for bringing her home and despair for the hole Vaughn left behind. Jason could see the storm in her eyes and knew that protecting her now meant more than keeping her physically safe. It meant guarding her spirit from being consumed by guilt and vengeance. Yet how could he do that while pursuing the very trail Vaughn's dying words had laid before him? Jason understood that the truth Vaughn gave him was a weapon, but weapons demanded to be used. Dalton's research had not died in the fire, Sidwell's money had not vanished with the collapsing walls, and the named master pulling strings from the shadows was still at large. That knowledge sat heavy in Jason's mind, forcing him to confront a brutal reality. If he turned away, Vaughn's death would mean nothing. If he pressed forward, Jocelyn, Britt, and even Carly would once again be pulled into the line of fire. His life had always been defined by such choices, but this one was sharper, crueler, because it combined the grief of loss with the urgency of unfinished business. Britt's return to Port Charles was supposed to be a chance at reinvention, but Five Poppies dragged her back into a cycle she thought she had escaped. Standing beside Jason once more, she felt the familiar pull of a world that demanded resilience, loyalty, and sacrifice. Yet this time, the stakes were different. She was not just another ally at his side. She was a woman who carried her own scars, her own secrets, and her own need for redemption. Watching Jason drown in guilt and determination, she questioned whether she could remain close to him without being consumed herself. She wanted to help, to prove that her survival was not wasted, but Carlyle's looming shadow made everything more volatile. Carlyle's bond with Jason was immovable, unshakable, and it forced Britt into the role of an outsider, no matter what she endured at his side. Carlyle's reaction would inevitably escalate the tension. For her, Jason was not simply a man but a constant in her life, someone who always placed her and her family above all else. The fact that Jocelyn's survival was tied to Jason once again reinforced her gratitude, but also reignited her possessiveness. She would demand answers about Five Poppies, about WSB's manipulation, about Brennan's betrayal, and about Jason's role in keeping secrets. In Carlyle's eyes, Jason's silence was both loyalty and betrayal, a paradox that strained their bond even as it held them together. For Britt, every word Carly spoke was a reminder that no matter what she offered Jason, she could never occupy that same unshakable place in his heart. What made everything more perilous was the simple truth that the fire at Five Poppies was not an end, it was a spark. The man Vaughn had named was still free, orchestrating plans that reached into Port Charles itself. Sidwell's influence still coursed through financial veins that connected corporations and governments alike. Dalton's research, though partially destroyed, could be resurrected elsewhere. Jason knew the fight was only beginning, and that Vaughn's final gift was not closure but a map to war. The only question was how many lives would be endangered as that war unfolded, and how much he could afford to lose in the process. The ghosts of Five Poppies would not rest quietly. They followed Jason in every glance over his shoulder, in every moment he caught Jocelyn staring into nothingness, and every flicker of hesitation in Britt's eyes. They were reminders that choices had consequences, and sacrifices carried debts that demanded repayment. Jason's path forward was clear but merciless. He had to honor Vaughn's sacrifice, unravel the conspiracy, and shield those he loved from the fallout. Yet with Carly's fury, Britt's uncertainty, and Jocelyn's grief all converging around him, he was forced to wonder whether the greatest danger was not the enemy in the shadows, but the fracture of the very bonds he was fighting to protect. In that moment of devastating clarity, it became apparent to everyone connected to the nightmare of Five Poppies that Port Charles would never again be the same. The fire and smoke that consumed the resort were not merely the destruction of a building, they were a marker in time, the severing of what came before from what was to come. The cost of uncovering the truth had already been written in blood. Vaughn's life extinguished so that others could live, but his sacrifice was not a quiet end. It was the spark of something larger, something darker, a revelation that the shadows stretching from Croatia to Port Charles were deeper and far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. His final words, whispered with the weight of urgency, carried secrets potent enough to ignite wars, secrets that would become fuel for every conflict yet to unfold. Jason, carrying those truths like a burden strapped to his soul, knew that his role was no longer about one rescue or one mission, it was about confronting an enemy that thrived in silence and deception. The faces of Dalton, Sidwell, and the nameless master behind them haunted him, not because of who they were individually but because of the enormity of their reach. Vaughn had handed him the pieces of a puzzle that, once assembled, would expose an empire of manipulation, greed, and power. Jason had always lived in a world where danger followed him, but now that danger was no longer confined to him alone. It stretched toward Jocelyn, toward Britt, toward Carly, and toward everyone who dared stand near him. His code, his sense of loyalty and honor, would demand that he act, but he knew that by stepping forward, he would be dragging all of them into the eye of a storm. Jocelyn, scarred by the knowledge that Vaughn had died for her, would be forced to grow in ways she was unprepared for. Survivor's guilt would shape her decisions, pulling her between wanting to retreat into the safety of her mother's arms and wanting to honor Vaughn's choice by becoming stronger, braver, more relentless. She would look to Jason for protection, but she would also hold him accountable, silently questioning why her life was spared while Vaughn's was not. That turmoil would make her vulnerable to the very darkness Vaughn had warned against, the temptation to seek control over a world that had stolen so much from her. Britt, freed from captivity yet chained once again to Jason's orbit, found herself facing the cruel reality that survival had not given her peace, it had only deepened her entanglement. Standing beside Jason meant stepping into a war she had not chosen, but walking away meant betraying herself, betraying the very second chance she had been given. And yet, Britt knew that her presence was both a strength and a liability. Jason's unwavering loyalty to Carly was a wedge she could not ignore, one that would grow sharper as the chaos in Port Charles expanded. Every decision Jason made in the battles ahead would ripple through their fragile connection, threatening to break it apart before it had the chance to become something real. For Carly, relief at her daughter's return was quickly eclipsed by anger. Her protective instincts made her dangerous, her wrath a weapon as sharp as any Jason carried. The realization that Jocelyn had been manipulated into a mission for WSB, exposed to life-threatening risks without her knowledge or consent, lit a fury inside her that could not be contained. Brennan, Sidwell, Dalton, every name connected to the betrayal became a target in her mind. But so too did Jason, who once again had chosen silence over transparency, dragging her family into peril without fully revealing the scope of the danger. Her trust, as strong as it had always been, now trembled under the weight of deception, setting the stage for conflicts that would test even their unbreakable bond. The darkness from Five Poppies had not ended and fire it had only spread and seen, like smoke drifting into every corner of their lives. Vaughn's death was a message written in sacrifice. The enemy was real. The stakes were higher than anyone could comprehend, and no one in Port Charles was beyond reach. What had begun as a mission in Croatia would now evolve into something larger, pulling the town into a war fought in shadows, where allies would be tested, loyalties strained, and the line between truth and betrayal blurred beyond recognition. Jason, Britt, Jocelyn, and Carly stood at the threshold of that storm, each carrying their own scars and fears, each about to be reshaped by the battles to come. The ghosts of Five Poppies followed them home, whispering reminders that nothing was over, that the fight had only just begun. The price of truth had already claimed one life, but the real cost was still to be paid. And Port Charles itself would be the battleground where every secret Vaughn left behind would come roaring to life.